Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are looking at the ultimate legislative nuclear button, cloture.
Right, the filibuster breaker.
Exactly. You probably know it as the tool that stops politicians from, talking a bill to death. But the raw mechanics of how this rule is actually used to force a vote and sometimes completely silence a minority is, honestly, it's a global blood sport.
Oh, absolutely.
If you follow politics, you already know parliamentary procedure is high stakes. But today we're taking a stack of notes from a massive Wikipedia article on this single rule to see how a supposedly dry, arcane mechanism has literally shaped global history.
Because it is the hidden operating system of democracy. I mean, we all tend to focus on the charismatic politicians, the big speeches, the campaigns.
Sure.
But when you strip all of that away, these procedural rules are what actually dictate whether a bill becomes the law of the land or just dies completely unnoticed on the floor.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly are we talking about when we say cloture? Depending on where you are in the world, it might be called closure or, even more dramatically, the guillotine.
Yeah, that one paints a picture.
It really does. The root of the word is actually French. Cloture literally translates to the act of terminating something. But to really understand why human beings had to invent a rule to force politicians to just stop talking, we have to cross the Atlantic. The modern political origin story of this takes us to the UK, specifically to a truly unbelievable scene in 1881.
This is a perfect example of what happens when the noble theory of unlimited free speech just crashes headfirst into the reality of a government that actually needs to function.
Right.
Because for centuries, the UK Parliament didn't have a formal way to force a vote. The assumption was just that gentlemen would debate until they were finished.
Very polite.
Exactly, and then they would vote.
But then comes January 1881. You have the second ministry or Prime Minister William Ewart Gladstone. He's trying to move the first reading, which is essentially just the initial formal introduction of a highly controversial piece of legislation called the Protection of Person and Property Bill.
And this was a harsh response to the Irish agrarian disturbances known as the Land War.
Yeah, and the Irish Parliamentary Party, led by Charles Stewart Parnell, decides they are not going to play by those gentlemanly unwritten rules. They're going to use the most extreme obstructionism possible. They're going to filibuster this bill into oblivion.
What's fascinating here is the sheer physical endurance involved in this protest. They weren't just delaying the vote for an afternoon or making a few long speeches. They kept the debate going for a 22-hour continuous sitting.
Just brutal.
And then, following a brief reset, they went into a staggering 41-hour continuous sitting.
41 hours. I mean, just picture the reality of that room, the absolute exhaustion of the members of parliament, the clerks desperately trying to keep the records, the smell of the chamber,
Oh, yeah.
the sheer physical toll on the Speaker of the Commons, Henry Brand, who had to just sit there and preside over this endless marathon.
And that physical toll is exactly what broke the system. Finally, in the early hours of February 2nd, Speaker Brand essentially snaps.
He'd had enough.
He takes completely unprecedented action. When the next Irish Parliamentary Party MP stands up to speak, the Speaker simply refuses to recognize him.
Wow.
He just unilaterally cuts them off, declares the debate over, and forces the motion to be put to a vote, which of course passes.
Hold on. So one single guy, the Speaker, just decides to break the rules to make the parliament function. Doesn't that give one person dictatorial power over the entire legislative body?
That was exactly the argument the Irish MPs made. They were furious. They objected immediately, arguing that this was a massive tyrannical abuse of their rights as elected members.
I bet.
But the government's response wasn't to apologize or reprimand the Speaker. Their response was to formalize what he just did. The very next day, Prime Minister Gladstone moved an amendment to the standing orders to create a formal, written process for declaring urgency and ending debate.
He actually noted that this was a subject of the extremist gravity. They knew they were fundamentally altering the nature of Parliament. And by 1887, under the Salisbury Ministry, that emergency rule was further amended to look a lot like the system the UK uses today.
That's right.
But I know the modern UK system is incredibly nuanced. How does it actually work if a majority wants to shut down a debate today?
In the House of Commons today, ending debate is not just a matter of having one more vote than the other side. A closure motion does require a simple majority, but you also must have a minimum of 100 MPs voting in favor of it.
Okay.
And here's the real safety valve. The Speaker of the House of Commons retains the power to deny the closure motion entirely.
Wait, so even if 300 MPs want to end the debate, the Speaker could just say no?
Precisely. If the speaker feels like the issue hasn't been debated sufficiently, or if they look at the situation and decide the majority is just trying to trample the rights of the minority to be heard, the speaker will deny the motion. The debate continues.
That's a huge amount of trust placed in one role.
It is a massive amount of discretionary power vested in one person to protect the democratic process.
That is a wild contrast to how the House of Lords handles it. In the Lord Speaker has absolutely no equivalent power to deny a closure motion, right?
None whatsoever. If a member of the Lords moves for closure, the Lord Speaker is simply required to read a formal statement. They basically announce that moving this motion is a most exceptional procedure, and then they ask the member if they are absolutely sure they want to persist.
Just a vibe check.
Yeah, pretty much. And if the member says yes, the motion is put to a vote immediately with zero debate. The Lord Speaker cannot stop it.
It's essentially a verbal warning label. Are you sure you want to press the nuclear button? And we should clarify the terminology here for you listening, because the UK has a few different flavors of this. Specific to legislation, there's a procedure called an allocation of time motion. Informally and rather aggressively, they call this a guillotine motion. How did the guillotine work?
A guillotine motion limits the amount of time that can be spent on a particular stage of a bill. So they might agree, we will debate this section for exactly 3 hours. When that clock runs out, the guillotine literally drops on the debate. Everything ceases.
Brutal.
A single vote is taken immediately. And if they are at the committee or report stage of a bill, that single vote accepts all the remaining undebated sections and government amendments all at once.
You don't even get to discuss the later parts of the bill. It just gets chopped and passed.
Exactly. Though it is worth noting that the classic brutal guillotine motion has largely been replaced in the Commons by something called a program motion.
A program motion.
Right. This is where the amount of time for each stage of a bill is agreed upon in advance, usually after the bill's second reading, which is the main debate on the bill's general principles. It's a bit more civilized and predictable. And crucially, neither guillotines nor program motions are permitted in the House of Lords.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the Lords simply do not allow those kinds of strict time restrictions on their debates.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because while the UK gave us the modern origin story, the United States Senate is where the word cloture became a household term. The U.S. Senate is globally famous for the filibuster, the ability of a senator to stand up and talk a bill to death. But cloture wasn't actually in the original rulebook of the U.S. Senate, was it?
It wasn't. For over a century, the United States Senate operated with no mechanism to cut off debate. The assumption was absolute free speech. That finally changed during World War I.
Right.
In March of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson was desperately trying to pass a bill to arm merchant vessels because of unrestricted, deadly German submarine warfare. But a group of just 12 anti-war senators, led by Republicans Henry Cabot Lodge and Charles Curtis, managed to completely kill the bill through a filibuster.
And Wilson was not happy.
Wilson was furious. He urged the Senate to adopt a rule to allow for cloture, and they did, passing it by a massive vote of 76-3.
And they successfully used it for the first time just a couple of years later, in November 1919, to end a filibuster on the Treaty of Versailles. But getting cloture wasn't a simple majority back then. The math of the U.S. Senate is the whole ballgame. Originally, the rule required a supermajority of 2/3 of all senators present and voting.
Right, and that wording is critical. Present and voting creates a shifting dynamic threshold. Think of it like a classroom.
Okay.
If all 100 senators were present in the room, you needed 67 votes to end debate. But if 20 senators were out sick or just refused to show up, the total number of kids in the classroom is only 80. 2/3 of 80 is just 54.
So absences actually lowered the bar and made it easier for the majority to win.
Exactly.
But even with that shifting threshold, it proved incredibly difficult to achieve. Between 1927 and 1962, the Senate tried to invoke cloture 11 different times, and it failed every single time.
And the historical context from our source material is vital to understand why this matters. During this specific era, Southern Democratic senators heavily utilized the filibuster to block civil rights legislation. The supermajority requirement meant that a highly coordinated, dedicated minority could continuously halt major civil rights progress for decades.
Because it was so incredibly hard to overcome, the math eventually changed. In 1975, the Democratic Senate majority pushed through a massive rule change. They had just gained seats in the 74 elections, giving them a total of 62 votes when counting an independent who caucused with them. They lowered the threshold from two-thirds of those present and voting to three-fifths of all senators duly chosen and sworn. Can you translate that for us?
Absolutely. That phrase, duly chosen and sworn, completely changes the game. It changes the math from whoever happens to be sitting in the classroom to the total enrollment of the school.
Ah,
It means you need three-fifths of the entire 100-seat Senate, regardless of who is sick, who is traveling, or who is abstaining. It locked the magic number at a hard 60 votes.
that is exactly why today, whenever you read the news, you constantly hear that a bill needs 60 votes to pass the U.S. Senate. The bill itself technically only needs a simple majority of 51 to pass, but you need 60 votes to invoke cloture to end the debate so you can actually take that final 51-vote passage vote.
Exactly. And the modern mechanics of how they actually execute this are like a highly choreographed, painfully slow dance.
Walk us through that. How does a senator actually trigger this today?
First, you need a minimum of 16 senators to sign a formal cloture motion. It is a literal piece of paper that states, "We, the undersigned senators, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the measure." They file that piece of paper, and then they wait. The motion has to undergo what is called a ripening process.
Ripening, like an avocado.
Sort of. The Senate rules mandate a cooling-off period. The motion ripens 1 hour after the Senate convenes on the second calendar day of session following the filing. So if a group of senators files the motion on Monday afternoon, they are not actually voting on whether to end the debate until Wednesday morning. It forces everyone to take a breath.
And if they do hold the vote on Wednesday, and they actually hit that magic 60-vote threshold, does the bill just pass right then and there?
Not at all. Hitting 60 votes just triggers the final countdown. It initiates a strict 30-hour maximum time limit of post-cloture debate. During those final 30 hours, the rules get incredibly tight. No single senator may speak for more than 1 hour. You can't propose more than 2 amendments until everyone else has had a turn.
And I imagine they restrict the kind of amendments you can offer, too.
Very strictly. Every amendment offered during those 30 hours has to be germane, which is a parliamentary term meaning it must be strictly relevant to the actual text of the bill. You can't attach a random amendment about highway funding to a healthcare bill just to waste time. Furthermore, no dilatory motions are allowed.
Dilatory motions, meaning bad faith motions designed purely to waste time and stall the clock.
Correct. No endless requests for roll calls or quorum checks just to burn hours. The system imposes extreme order on a body that famously prides itself on unlimited debate. Once that 30-hour clock hits zero, the presiding officer cuts off anyone who is speaking and forces the final vote.
Which brings us to the modern era. Because, as we have seen in recent years, that 60-vote threshold has become a massive point of contention, leading to what is dramatically known as the nuclear option.
Right.
Now, before we dive into this next part, I need to explicitly pause and give a quick disclaimer to you, the listener. We are about to cover some highly politically charged historical events from our source material regarding the U.S. Senate. I want to emphasize that neither of us is taking a side here. We are not endorsing a viewpoint, and we are not making a political statement about who was right, who was wrong, or who started it. Our mission is simply to report the factual, chronological timeline of how these procedural rules changed over the last decade, exactly as outlined in the Wikipedia sources.
Precisely. We are observing the raw mechanics of the institution under pressure. So let's look at the precedent set in 2013 under Democratic Majority Leader Harry Reid. The context at the time was that many of President Barack Obama's nominees were being filibustered by the Republican minority. Specifically, Republicans were refusing to confirm nominees to the highly influential D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
So, on November 21st, 2013, Harry Reid makes a major move. He raises a parliamentary point of order. He essentially states that the threshold for invoking cloture on executive and judicial nominations, excluding the Supreme Court, should be a simple majority of 51, not the traditional 60 votes.
Right.
Now, the presiding officer of the Senate looks at the physical rulebook, sees that the written rule still clearly says 60, and overrules Reid's point of order. But then, Reid appeals to the full Senate to vote on whether to sustain the chair's ruling.
And this is the turning point. By a vote of 48 to 52, the Senate voted to overturn the ruling of the chair.
Wait, so they didn't actually rewrite the official rulebook? They just had a majority vote to ignore the referee's interpretation of the rulebook.
Exactly. They established a new parliamentary precedent rather than a formal rule rewrite. All the Republicans, along with 3 Democrats, voted to sustain the chair's ruling, but they were outvoted. Just like that, the threshold for those lower court and executive nominees was lowered to a simple majority.
Then, fast forward to April 6, 2017. The balance of power has completely flipped. Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is now in charge, and he's dealing with a filibuster by Democrats of President Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Neil Gorsuch.
And McConnell uses the exact same procedural playbook. He raises a point of order that the 2013 precedent should now be expanded to also apply to Supreme Court nominations. The presiding officer, reading the rules, overrules him. McConnell appeals the ruling to the floor.
And the result is a mirror image. By a vote of 48 to 52, with all Democrats voting to sustain the chair, the Senate overturns the ruling once again. The simple majority rule was officially expanded to include the highest court in the land.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what you are seeing in both 2013 and 2017 is a classic procedural arms race. These are legislative bodies where the rules that were originally designed to foster slow debate and require broad consensus are continually being adapted or bypassed entirely to break partisan gridlock. The sheer political pressure to deliver results simply overwhelmed the century-old tradition of the supermajority.
So what does this all mean for the rest of the world? How do other nations handle a filibuster? Is everyone playing this high-stakes game of procedural chicken? Let's take a tour of some Commonwealth nations, starting with Canada.
A great example.
They adopted closure in 1913 under Conservative Prime Minister Robert Borden after the opposition kept relentlessly delaying a naval aid bill. But the most amazing trivia nugget for you listening is that they actually used closure in 1964 to force the adoption of Canada's iconic red maple leaf flag.
That flag debate is a perfect example of why these rules exist. You are talking about changing a core symbol of national identity. For some, the old flag represented vital colonial ties, and for others, the new maple leaf was the birth of modern Canada.
High stakes.
Very. It was a deeply emotional, highly contentious debate that was never ever going to end naturally. People were too passionate. The government realized that without a procedural guillotine, the country would just be paralyzed.
In Canada, they strictly use the term closure. They don't say cloture or guillotine. Any minister can give oral notice of their intention to call for closure at a prior sitting. When the motion is finally made, it passes by a simple majority. But what I find fascinating is how strict they are about the clock once it passes.
It is incredibly regimented. If the closure motion passes, every single member is allotted a maximum of one 20-minute period to speak, and there is a hard, non-negotiable deadline. All voting must happen by 8 p.m. that exact same day.
I love that, a strict 8 p.m. cutoff. We're going home, folks. Time to vote.
Yeah.
It's so pragmatic. Down in Australia and New Zealand, the mechanics are even blunter. In Australia, they don't hide behind polite terminology. They literally call it the gag or the guillotine. A minister can simply declare a bill urgent and move a motion to limit debating time.
And the Australian gag is incredibly sharp. That urgency motion cannot be debated. It cannot be amended. It must be voted on immediately. New Zealand is similar in its speed, but slightly more democratic in how it starts.
How?
In New Zealand, any member of parliament, not just a minister, can move a closure motion once they are called to speak. If the length of the debate wasn't already fixed by their standing orders, the speaker has the discretion to put the closure motion to a vote, which just requires a simple majority. Very fast, very efficient.
Which brings us to a genuinely wild and controversial example from Hong Kong in 2012. The Legislative Council was dealing with a massive marathon filibuster on an amendment bill. By May, they had been debating this single issue for over 33 straight hours.
Exhausting.
It's 4 a.m, everyone is exhausted. Finally, a council member named Philip Wong Yu-hong stands up and basically says, look, other countries have this thing called a cloture motion. I suggest the president ends this debate right now.
And the president of the Legislative Council, Sang Yak-sing, agreed with him. He stated that he wasn't going to allow the debate to go on endlessly. But here's the massive catch, the thing that caused absolute chaos. Cloture was not defined anywhere in the rules or precedents of the Hong Kong Legislative Council. The concept simply did not exist in their rulebook.
So how did he actually do it? If it's not in the rules, how do you enforce it?
He used a catch-all loophole. He invoked Standing Order 92, which basically says that if a specific matter isn't provided for in their own rules, the president can be guided by the practice and procedure of other legislatures. So he looked at places like the UK and Canada, and he invoked cloture. But he did it without holding a cloture vote. He just unilaterally ended the debate.
Wait, he didn't even make the council vote to gag themselves.
Exactly, and that caused an immediate uproar. Another member, Lun Kwakang, stood up and rightly pointed out that a cloture without a vote was entirely unheard of anywhere else in the democratic world. Even in the strictest, bluntest systems we've discussed today, like Australia's gag rule, the legislature still has to vote as a majority to silence the debate. The president just declaring it over based on a vague catch-all rule was highly questionable.
I can imagine.
Yet, despite the outrage, Sangyak Singh invoked that exact same power again the very next year, in 2013, to halt debate on an appropriation bill. It's incredible. From the 41-hour, sweaty, exhausted standoff in Ireland in 1881, to the shifting math of the modern U.S. Senate, to a 4 a.m. unilateral shutdown in Hong Kong. We have covered a lot of ground today. And for you listening, whether you are managing a team, sitting on a local board, or just watching the news, this is why understanding procedure matters. We spend so much time as citizens arguing about the issues themselves, but the actual outcomes, the laws that end up governing our daily lives, are heavily dictated by these hidden rules. The operating system of the legislature is just as powerful as the people running it.
This raises an important question, a paradox, really. Something for you to think about long after this deep dive ends. If the entire foundational purpose of a deliberative assembly, a parliament, a senate, is to debate ideas freely and ensure the minority has a voice against the majority, at what point does the mechanism meant to save democracy from gridlock actually silence the very debate it was built to protect? Where exactly is the line between an essential tool for legislative progress and a weapon used to crush the opposition? That is the perfect thought to leave you with. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Cloture. We'll catch you next time.